Welcome to this next study of Revelation at the Dove Church. This time we're going to be looking at Revelation chapter 15, which is quite a short chapter, so we'll do it all. So to summarise briefly, chapter 14, we saw the Lamb on Mount Zion with the redeemed people, the 144,000. And this was followed by 3 angels in mid-heaven, flying angels. And they came with an ultimatum to fear God and give him glory, because the time of his judgment has come, with the declaration that Babylon has fallen, and with the condemnation that if anyone worships the beast in its image and receives its mark, he will drink the wine of God's fury. And that was followed by 2 accounts of harvest, of a grain harvest that was carried out by one like a son of man wielding a sickle, seated on a cloud, and of a grape harvest carried out by angels, where the grapes were thrown into the great winepress of God's wrath, and when they were trampled and blood flew out. And it very much tied in with this idea of the wine of God's fury. Now, this all looks terminal. It looks like the end of everything. But it's actually setting us up for the final movements of the book of Revelation, which include the last plagues, which culminated in the destruction of Babylon and the defeat of the beast and of his followers, and then the establishment of a new creation in the last couple of chapters. And we have that ahead of us. So let's pray in the words of John in this chapter. Father, great and marvellous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. Father, through what we study in this session, Father, please help us to see you more clearly, to love you more dearly, and to follow you more nearly through our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. So let's jump into Revelation 15. I saw in heaven another great and marvellous sign. 7 angels with the 7 last plagues. Last, because with them God's wrath is completed. And I saw what looked like a sea of glass, glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea were those who had been victorious over the beast and its image, and over the number of its name. They held harps given to them by God, and sang the song of Moses, God's servant, and of the Lamb. Great and marvellous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. After this I looked, and I saw in heaven the temple, that is, the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was opened. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen and wore golden sashes around their chests. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. So, the first half or so of this, verses 2 to 4, consists of the redeemed, those who have been victorious over the beast and its image, and over the number of its name, standing beside the sea outside the temple, holding harps given to them by God, and praising him in song. verse 2 closely resembles verses 2 and 3 in the previous chapter, where the redeemed, identified there as the 144,000, were on Mount Zion with the Lamb. And they sang a new song to the sound of harpists. So there's a definite parallel between the beginning of chapter 14 and the beginning of chapter 15. The remaining 4 verses bring us back to the open temple, described in the NIV at least as the tabernacle of the covenant law. We'll look at that later on. And as in chapter 14, verse 15 and 17, angels emerge from the temple to enact judgment. And this sets up the pouring out of the 7 last plagues in the next chapter, chapter 16, which reaches its culmination in the destruction of Babylon, chapters 17 and 18, and of the beast and the false prophet in chapters 18 and 19. So let's look more closely. So verse 1. I saw in heaven another great and marvellous sign. 7 angels with the 7 last plagues, because with them God's wrath is completed. The beginning of chapter 15 then introduces 7 bowl judgments. We call them the bowl judgments because they're judgments that are poured out of these bowls. The 7 last plagues. And these are mostly described in the next chapter, in chapter 16. And we're told very clearly that with them, God's wrath is completed. And this will be the end of the process. God is not by nature wrathful, but his wrath is necessary and proportional. It's a response to the evil that has corrupted both heaven and earth. But it will soon be completed and the evil expunged. And the appearance in heaven of these 7 plague-bearing angels is called another great and marvellous sign, and it's the 3rd such sign to be identified in Revelation. Back in chapter 12, we encountered in heaven also 2 signs called a great sign and another sign, the woman and the dragon. Rather like bookends, in fact, in chapter 12 and in chapter 15. In that discussion in August last year, if you remember, we said that these signs were metaphorical. In fact, we said that they were mythic, not in the sense that they are untrue in any way, but that they're archetypal. And in chapter 12, these things are literally written in the stars. They are presented as timeless truths. So the accounts of the woman, her child, and her dragon work a bit like parables that break the message of salvation down to its very basic spiritual movements, its constituent parts, if you like. And they reveal God's ultimate and total victory over the dragon. In chapter 12, there's this great sign, the woman and her child, and then another sign, the dragon, who's defeated by Michael, and then the beasts in chapter 13 follow from them, and then God's response in chapter 14 extends those signs still further. So altogether, we've got the woman, the male child, the dragon, the 2 beasts, the 144,000, the flying angels, and then the harvests that we saw at the end of chapter 14. And here in chapter 15, we have another great and marvellous sign, using almost exactly the same phrase. And it brings us full circle to the completion of God's wrath. And we'll look at those in a moment. But first of all, let's think about this for a bit. The woman is described as a great sign in chapter 12, verse 1, and the dragon as another sign in verse 3. So here in chapter 15, we see another great and marvellous sign. And this forms an envelope, a kind of envelope of heavenly signs. Some scholars call this an inclusio. like bookends, if you will. So that poses some questions. So here's a question. Does this mean, therefore, that everything between these signs in chapter 12 and chapter 15 is metaphorical? Does this mean that everything between these signs is therefore metaphorical? This inclusio between these signs comes inside another inclusio, another set of bookends about God's temple being opened, which we see at the end of chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 19, and then following the second set of signs in chapter 15, verses 5 and 6. And that these temple images pretty much makes up the whole of the Seventh Trumpet section from 11 verse 15 to 15 verse 8. So, thinking about that section, another question: how is God's temple being described here? How is God's temple being described here? So back to the completion of God's wrath. Here's a brief summary of God's wrath in Revelation so far. So in chapter 5, verses 15 to 17, we see the sixth seal being broken. And it says, "Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they called to the mountains and the rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?'" That's chapter 6. Then chapter 7 describes 4 angels who are holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any harm until those servants of God who are going to be sealed are sealed. They, or more specifically, the great multitude that we see following that, have come out of the great tribulation and therefore avoided the day of wrath. In chapter 8, the first 4 trumpets sound as objects fall from the sky, striking the earth and the heavens in a manner resembling the Egyptian plagues. And in 8:13, 3 woes are announced by an angel, again flying in mid-heaven. The first woe is the 5th trumpet, chapter 9, verses 1 to 12, where the abyss is opened and an army of monstrous scorpion locust creatures comes out to torment people. The second woe appears to begin with the 6th trumpet, chapter 9, verses 30 to 21, the massed armies at the Euphrates, and in particular the 3 plagues of smoke, fire, and sulphur that come out of the horses' mouths and kill a third of humanity. And it ends at chapter 11, verse 14, after the martyrdom and ascension of the 2 witnesses. It says the second woe has passed, the third is coming soon. And so the third woe, in this section, which we have just described, and we see the dragon, Satan, as he's identified, hurled down from heaven to earth, and his angels with him. That's chapter 12, verse 9. And then in chapter 13, we see the 2 beasts exercising the power of the dragon over humanity and giving their mark to those who follow them. And then in chapter 14, we see the wrath of God explicitly described as the worshippers of the beast, those who take his mark, verse chapter 14, verse 10, they drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. And this scene of judgment climaxes in the grape harvest, where chapter 14, 19 and 20, the angel swung his sickle on the earth and gathered its grapes and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. So a lot of wrath language here. And they were trampled in the winepress outside the city, and blood flowed out of the press. So in these 7 last plagues introduced in chapter 15, God's wrath is completed. And this will take us to the end of chapter 19, where the beast and the false prophet are finally confronted by the glorified word of God and consigned to the lake of fire. That's chapter 19, verse 20. We don't get the detail of these last plagues until chapter 16. But John continues to build the scene. So, a question. What do we learn about the nature of God's wrath in this chapter? What do we learn about the nature of God's wrath in this chapter? So verses 2 to 4. I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the sea, those who'd been victorious over the beast and its image and over the number of its name. They held harps given to them by God and sang the song of Moses, of God's servant Moses, and of the Lamb. Great and marvellous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty. Just and true are your ways, King of the nations. Who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. So, what is the song of Moses and the Lamb? What is the song of Moses and the Lamb? So, verse 2. We've seen a sea of glass before. Way back in chapter 4, verse 6, it was one of the first things that alerted us to the idea that we, with John, were being shown God's heavenly temple. Also, in front of the throne, there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. And this sea of glass corresponds, in temple imagery, with the large metal basin that was called a sea in most versions of scripture, which is placed in the courtyard of Solomon's temple adjacent to the altar, which is described in 2 Chronicles 4 verse 2. He made the sea of cast metal, circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits, about 5 meters, from rim to rim, and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure round it. So this huge reservoir was used for storing water, in which the priests would ritually wash their hands and feet. And there had been something similar on a smaller scale in the tabernacle. And this sea in Revelation, which is before God's throne, is clear as crystal, pure water, I guess. Those beside it are those who surround God's throne. So we get this repeated image of a sea, and God's people are beside it, or around it, or close beside it. Those surrounding God's those beside the sea in Revelation 4, are those who surround God's throne. They're the living creatures, the elders, the angels, and everything and everyone that is included in that magnificent hymn of praise to God in chapters 4 and 5, the whole of creation. So in verses 3 and 4, we see in the same scene, we see in particular there is the Lamb who's also standing adjacent to the sea, who takes the scroll from God's hand, and the living creatures and the elders sing the song of the Lamb. Revelation 5, 9 and 10. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and with your blood you purchased for God persons of every tribe and language and people and nation. And you've made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth. The song of the Lamb. He purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation, and he made them a kingdom and priests, and they will reign. So that's a sea, and God's people, God himself no less, are standing beside it. And then in chapter 13, in my reading at least, we see John, one of God's people for sure, standing on the shore of the sea as the beast emerged from it. But the sea here, surrounded by those who've been victorious over the beast, is glowing with fire. Verse 15, chapter 15, glowing with fire. And perhaps this is in anticipation of chapter 19, where the beast and the false prophet were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur by the very word of God himself. So maybe this is a foreshadow of that. We're also reminded of the Red Sea. It's the song of Moses, after all, beside which Moses led the people in a song of salvation after their rescue from slavery in Egypt. That's Exodus 15. God's people there stood beside the sea, which had been a means of judgment. The people came through the sea then closed on the Egyptian pursuers. So this is the song of Moses as well as of the Lamb. And finally, in chapter 21, verse 1, John tells us that in the new heavens and the new earth, there's no longer any sea. Which is, when you first read that, you think, why is there no sea? It seems a strange thing to say, to make a point of saying there's no longer any sea. Perhaps he means that the sea, the mythical abode of Leviathan, and from which arise these evil beasts, it has a metaphorical mythic meaning. It's the home of chaos and disorder. It's where Leviathan comes from, these beasts that arise in Daniel and here in Revelation. It's the source of these things, and it's ended. All evil, in fact, is not only defeated, but it's eradicated from the earth when Christ's kingdom is fully established. And I think maybe that's the meaning of this idea that there's no longer any sea. So in all of these places, all the way through Scripture, indeed from Genesis 1, the very beginning of Genesis 1, where darkness was on the face of the deep, the sea in all of these places contains this threat of evil and violence and the breaking of boundaries and disorder. But nevertheless, God controls it totally. Psalm 74 verse 13, it was you who split the sea by your power and broke the heads of the monster in the waters. So, chapter, a question on that. What does the sea signify in this chapter and throughout Revelation? What does the sea signify in this chapter and throughout Revelation? So moving on, verses 5 to 8. After this I looked, and I saw in heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was open. And out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen, and they wore golden sashes around their chests. One of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. So, verse 5, this the tabernacle of the testimony, or the temple of the covenant law, the covenant law. So here is the heavenly temple again, opened. And it's called, in the NIV, it's called the temple, that is the tabernacle of the covenant law, which is a particular phrase the NIV uses. I'm not sure if it's a good translation. I think it could potentially be misleading. The phrase covenant law suggests a legal framework to the covenant, but the Greek text has something like the temple of the tabernacle of the testimony, which has a different emphasis, I think. So, another quick look back at Exodus. What are we talking about? What is this testimony? Testimony was located in the Ark of the Covenant. It's called sometimes the Ark of the Testimony. And it contains certain items of great significance to the people of Israel. There were the 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments. You find that in Deuteronomy 10:5. There was a jar of manna, Exodus 16 verses 32 and 33. And there was also Aaron's rod that budded, Numbers 17:8 to 10. These things represented God's presence with his people, his faithfulness to the promises he's made, and the law he gave to the people to define the terms of the covenant. So it is the tabernacle of the covenant law, but it's more than that. This is a testimony of the faithfulness of God to his people, his faithfulness to his promises and to his word. And the ark occupied the most holy place in the tabernacle, closed off behind a thick curtain. But here, the holy place is open, as viewed from earth. As in chapter 11, verse 19, we talked about this inclusio, these bookends. God's testimony is on display, which reflects the last part of the song in verse 4. You alone are holy. All the nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. Isaiah 52 says, before the nations you have bared your holy arm. No longer is this testimony, this covenant with God, something which is sealed off, something which is hidden, something which is sacred to the Jewish people and no one else. It's revealed and all the nations can see it. God's holiness, God's righteousness, God's faithfulness are being vindicated before all the nations. The temple is open. So that kind of closes the inclusio. We've got 2 sets of brackets here. We've got the open temple at the end of chapter 11, and then the open temple at the end of chapter 15. We've got the signs, a great sign and another sign, at the beginning of chapter 12, and then another great and marvellous sign at the beginning of chapter 15, and these form two sets of brackets, and then in between we've got the beast, we've got the woman and the dragon and the beasts and so forth. So everything that's happened there between chapters 12 and the beginning of chapter 15 is happening in the context of the open temple, of the covenant of God, his holiness, his faithfulness, his righteousness being revealed to the nations. These 7 angels come out of the open temple, just like the angels in chapter 14. Various angels come out of the temple, and like them, they come out for the purpose of judgment. They're going to enact the judgment of God, and they're dressed again like the man that Daniel saw beside the river in Daniel 10 verse 5, and perhaps like the Son of Man in Revelation 1:13, in clean shining linen with the golden sash, so that there's a consistency in the way that these heavenly men are described. And it seems that they have a priestly function. They're angels, but they perhaps function in the role of priests. They're serving in the temple, and they're serving from the temple. They're going out from the temple. And they're being given by one of the living creatures these bowls containing the wrath of God. Bowls or phials. One of the 4 living creatures gave, this is verse 7, one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with the wrath of God, who lives for ever and ever. The word used for bowl is phial, phiale in Greek. And these will be part of the temple equipment, used as part of the temple ritual, rather than the kind of bowl that they'll put the cornflakes in. They're sacred equipment. Several words for bowls of various kind are used in the description of the tabernacle worship in Exodus, but in Exodus 27:3 in the Greek translation, the Septuagint, the word translated as sprinkling bowl is phiale. Make all its utensils of bronze, its pots to remove the ashes, its shovels, its sprinkling bowls, meat forks, and fire pans. And these bowls are these bowls given to the angels are a particular kind of bowl, and they're used in the temple worship for sprinkling. They're used for the grain offerings, but they're also used for sprinkling, for example, the blood of an animal against the altar. And these particular bowls are filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. It's a little bit like, I guess, chapter 14, verse 10, where the wine of God's fury is poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. So verse 8, the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. So the temple is open, but effectively it's closed because it's full of the glory of God, appearing as smoke. Temple filling with smoke reinforces the idea that these 7 angels are worshipping. They're involved in the worship of God. God's glory and his presence has filled the temple. And this is, again, it's a familiar image from the Old Testament. We see it in several places, particularly from the consecration accounts of the tabernacle and the temple. So let's have a look at a few of these. So from Exodus 40, as Moses completes the construction of the tabernacle. Verses 34 and 35. A cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And again, at the dedication of Solomon's temple, parallel passage in 2 Chronicles 5:13 and 14, the trumpeters and musicians joined in unison to give praise and thanks to the Lord, accompanied by trumpets, cymbals, and other instruments. The singers raised their voices in praise to the Lord and sang, "He is good and his love endures forever." Then the temple of the Lord was filled with a cloud, and the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, because the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So in both these cases, the presence of God filled the temple to the extent that his human ministers were unable to enter and fulfill their duty. We see something a little bit similar in Isaiah's famous vision in Isaiah 6:4. The temple was filled with smoke, the presence of the glory of God. But I think that perhaps the closest parallel to what we see here in the Old Testament is what is what Ezekiel describes. Ezekiel 10 verses 3 and 4. So we'll just read that. The cherubim were standing on the south side of the temple when the man went in, and the cloud filled the inner court. And then the glory of the Lord rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. The cloud filled the temple, and the court was full of the radiance of the glory of the Lord. So this man is a man clothed with linen, again, who is introduced in the previous chapter. He carries a writing kit and has been given the task in Ezekiel 9:4 of marking out those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things done in Jerusalem against 6 other angels who execute God's judgment, much it seems to Ezekiel's horror. So the glory of the Lord appears in his temple in the context of judgment, while 7 angels, well, at least 6, carry this judgment out upon those who have rejected God. So it's a similar scene. The earth is being prepared for purification by the separation of the Lamb's redeemed people from all the other earth dwellers. And this is emphasized by these angels' linen garments. They're holy, they're sacred, they're dedicated to the Lord. And the bowls used in the sprinkling of sacrificial blood. And the glory of the Lord is visible in this cloud, as the late Michael Heiser puts it in his Naked Bible podcast. The earth is being prepared for the reoccupation by the Messiah. In other words, it's being prepared to once again become sacred space. He's removing its defilement. He's going to destroy the beast. So Revelation 15 introduces the final phase of God's judgment upon those who reject him, on the vindication of his saints. We see God's victorious people singing his praises, in particular praising his justice as King of the nations, and noting that all the nations of the world would indeed worship him. And we see once again the temple open in heaven, its holiest place, declaring God's faithfulness and his righteousness on display for all the nations to see. And as the 7 bowl angels are commissioned by one of the living creatures, the temple is filled with the smoke of God's glory so that no one could enter it. That is chapter 15. A couple of questions to finish with. There is, as usual, a lot of Old Testament language in this chapter, particularly around worship in the temple. Does anything in particular, stand out to you? There's a lot of Old Testament language in this chapter, particularly around worship in the temple. Does anything in particular stand out to you? And is there a particular lesson or message that you can take from chapter 15? So next time we'll explore these final plagues in chapter 16. We'll see you then.